Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Yeah, welcome back for another round of Libertarian Angle. You know, Richard, there's been a lot in the news about the Green New Deal that the socialist left is bringing up as sort of a way to approach environmental issues and apparently a wide range of issues that extend far beyond the environmental issues. And then recently, as you know, President Trump was rebuffed by Congress in his incessant calls to build an immigration wall along the southern border of the United States. He was asking Congress for $5 billion to fund his wall. And Congress said no. So Trump, in order to ignore and circumvent Congress and the finest dictatorial tradition, has simply decreed an emergency. Says, well, now I've got an immigration emergency. I'm going to go build my wall anyway, and he's going to use U.S. taxpayer money somewhere. He's going to find it somewhere, whether it's the military budget or I read somewhere where he might use the monies that have been stolen from Americans traveling on highways with asset forfeiture, where the cops just steal money from people and never charge them with a crime. I think he's thinking about using that money. But as I was, listening to all this, it occurred to me that all this has relevance to the original New Deal. That is Franklin Roosevelt's socialist, fascist economic policy to address the emergency of the Great Depression and the stock market crash in 1929. So I thought what we ought to do is devote a show to the original New Deal to show what was going on there. As you'll recall, Roosevelt said that he was implementing this new system, which was really converting America to a socialist system, what we call a welfare state, where the government's primary job, the federal government, would be to take care of people. That would be its main charge domestically. And it would do this by taking money from some people through taxation and the force of taxation and transferring it to other people who would become the dole recipients. And what was fascinating about this revolutionary transformation of America's economic system was that is the way he posed it. He says, well, this isn't really that much different from what we've been doing, even though it clearly was, not only with the fascist aspects, the socialist aspects, but also the fascist aspects. You'll recall that he enacted his National Industrial Recovery Act, which was straight out of Mussolini's playbook over in Italy, where he had established a fascist system. It put businesses and industries into cartels, government supervised, setting their own prices and wages. There was this weird Blue Eagle campaign that again could have come straight out of fascist Italy, where people were exhorted to be patriots and support the National Industrial Recovery Act. So it really was a revolutionary transformation of America's economic system. But the way he posed it was, I'm saving free enterprise. These are just reforms to save the free enterprise system, rather than an abandonment of the free enterprise system, because he knew that people would have a tough time accepting that. So as long as people were convinced that this was just saving free enterprise, they were okay with it. And then the other ironic part of this, in a dark sense, was that it was the government that precipitated the crisis in the first place. And that's where the Federal Reserve comes in. This has been documented by libertarian economists like Milton Friedman and Murray Rothbard, Hans Sennholz, who have shown that the stock market crash in '29 was due to Federal Reserve monetary manipulation. Now, of course, statists would say, well, the Federal Reserve is part of America's free enterprise system, but actually it's not. America lived without a central bank for more than 100 years. A central bank, as you pointed out in your book for FFF, Monetary Central Planning in the State, this is a central planning agency, which makes it a socialist construct. And as a central planning agency, it brings what Mises called, Ludwig von Mises called, planned chaos, and that's what we've had in monetary policy. And so that's what caused the stock market crash in 29. The Federal Reserve had been expanding money and credit, and then they were panicking because at that time there was still the gold coin standard, and they were afraid that people were going to start demanding gold, run on the banks, and so they overcontracted. They caused the stock market crash, but it was all blamed on free enterprise, and Roosevelt decrees this emergency. We've got this giant, economic emergency. This gives me the power to do revolutionary things, extraordinary things, dictatorial things, totalitarian things. The most appalling was when he nationalized people's gold holdings. I mean, this was incredible. This had been the official money of the United States for more than 100 years, gold coins and silver coins. It was the monetary system established by the Constitution. And here this man is doing what communist rulers were doing, nationalizing people's gold, ordering them to turn their gold into the government, and then receiving irredeemable paper notes in return. It is just absolutely incredible, and turning people into felons if they retained their gold secretly and got caught. So it was all done, these dictatorial, totalitarian, socialist, fascist measures that Roosevelt were doing were under the guise of emergency, the same guise that Trump is using today with respect to immigration, and in the process revolutionizing America's economic system, of course, for the worst. What do you think, Richard?
Well, I think it's interesting to observe that when Franklin Roosevelt ran for the presidency in 1932 against the incumbent Herbert Hoover, part of his campaign stump speeches, and certainly the platform of the Democratic Party that year, was complaining that Herbert Hoover was a big government spender who taxed too much, was running up huge budget deficits and adding to the national debt. And therefore, Roosevelt was promising to cut government spending, reduce taxes, balance the budget, recognize states' rights in the form of constitutional federalism, and guarantee the maintenance of a gold standard. So instead, as you were saying, he takes office. At that time, presidents were inaugurated in March of the new year, not the current January. He was inaugurated in March of 1933. And he immediately begins to implement a series of programs, partly from these emergency acts, such as the gold confiscation, which dated from an emergency act from the First World War, through certain rubber stamping through Congress of the National Recovery Administration, which, as you said, was basically the imposition of economic fascism. As you pointed out, businesses of small, medium, and large sizes were mandated to join government-organized cartels in which prices and production quotas would be set, and they would be basically managed by that sector of the economy under government approval and supervision. Agriculture was basically collectivized in the form that the government established the Agricultural Adjustment Act. This basically was meant to do for farming what the NRA was doing for business, the cartelization of fascist economic planning. The government set agricultural prices, they set up production quotas, demanded and commanded the destruction of crops, the slaughtering of livestock. They were organizing huge public works projects, and indeed almost certainly fascist-like in the sense of the technique, or in Moscow under the Soviets, huge propaganda campaigns. Half times at football games would have the blimp flying over, and they'd have the old-fashioned camera reels, and they would be taking picture of the entertainment on the football field during halftime, and people would go out onto the field and they would form themselves in the form of the NRA symbol, the Blue Eagle. The Blue Eagle holding the electric bolt and the lightning bolt and the cog machine bolt. They would have parades to arouse the enthusiasm, the masses behind government planning. You can see old newsreels of this on YouTube. One of them is with Al Jolson, the famous singer of that time, saying "Mammy," And a reporter comes up to Al, it's all in this newsreel, and says, well, Al, what do you think of NRA? And Al Jolson says, NRA? NRA? Why, it's better than my wedding night. For those of you who are too young, that's when wedding nights used to mean something. I mean, and you also have these shorts that would show in the movie theaters with a very young Shirley Temple dancing, you know, about how wonderful government regulation planning is. Ginger Rogers of Rogers and Fred Astaire dance movies. She has this famous movie, Where in the Money? Where in the Money? It's all about the government monetizing silver so as to be able to expand the money supply. Listen to the lyrics of the song. You can watch this on YouTube too. And it's also, wow, the government is spending money, but now we can pay our rent. Now we can feed ourselves. We're in the money because of government inflation of the currency. So this was a huge propaganda campaign to arouse the enthusiasm of a national emergency, all under the presumption, if you will, that government has the knowledge, wisdom, and ability to know how to plan, direct, and command the economic activities of tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people. And this was the arrogance and the hubris, when in fact they were just doing this on the fly. Many books have been written about the Roosevelt era, including by people who had been in his administration, some anti, many pro, who was the New Deal. And Roosevelt would be in bed in the morning, and he would decide what the value of the dollar was going to be. Just he'd pick a number while looking at the stock market and the currency prices. And he said, we're interested in experimentation. If something doesn't work, we discard it and we try something new. This is basically arbitrary, discretionary, absolutist government with Roosevelt as a king. In fact, there is a cartoon, the Baltimore Sun was a strongly anti-Roosevelt, in a complimentary sense, conservative newspaper at that time. And they would have cartoons in it. One of them is Roosevelt holding up, with a crown on his head, holding up a copy of the Constitution, and written over the Constitution is void. Basically, meaning he is the Constitution, he is the law. Now that type of precedence, set up by Roosevelt in the 1930s and continued by many other presidents in different ways, is just what culminates in Trump now saying, well, Congress doesn't want to allocate this money for me, for my wall, and they'll only give me $2 or $3 billion in the approved budget. I demand this 5.7, and so I'm going to declare a national emergency. Oh, crisis! And I'm going to take forfeiture of money from this government account. I'm going to reallocate spending from that account. Now, the irony, the hypocrisy in this is, of course, the response of the Democrats. This is a violation of separation of powers. Money should only be allocated by Congress, approved. Now, look, it says there right here, unless approved by Congress, the president. Excuse me. There was a prior president, Barack Obama, and he decided to join Britain and France in intervening in what country? Libya, to get rid of that nice guy, Gaddafi. And suddenly the U.S. government had to undertake military expenditures to help support and fund the overthrow of a government in Libya by primarily the British and the French and the Italians. Where did that money come from? He declared an emergency, national emergency, and decided that he would just do this. What were people like Nancy Pelosi at that time saying? Oh, he's justified doing this. This is proper executive authority. This is all hypocrisy. Trump wants to do it for his purposes. Obama was trying to do it for his purposes. The people in Congress, depending upon who's in and who's out, just support it or oppose it to pander to their own groups for their own political purposes. But the bottom line is that we basically have unlimited, unleashed, uncontrolled, unrestricted government. What is the law? It's whatever a president or the Congress decides. What may government tax money be used for, or borrowed money be used for? Whatever can be justified and rationalized for the political purposes of the day as defined by the politicians in charge, whether in the White House or in the Congress. We have lawless government. We have unprincipled government. We basically have dictatorship of whoever is in charge to decide this is the legislation, this is what we're going to tax, or this is what I'm just going to spend money on anyway because I can just declare anything I want. We are in a regime that is basically the opposite of what the Founding Fathers intended.
Yeah, I'm reminded of General Pinochet, the military dictator of Chile, who the U.S. helped install into power. And his decrees were called decree laws. That whatever he decreed was the law. He didn't have to jack with the Congress or anything. He was the supreme dictator, and so in his mind he was acting in the interest of the country. But what did he need to get approval of Congress from? He was doing the right thing in his mind. So whatever he decreed became the law, and they became known as decree laws. Well, that's essentially how Maduro in Venezuela operates. He nullified the Congress there. But it's also how Trump now operates. He wants to start a trade war. He starts it. He doesn't have to go ask Congress's permission. Yes. He wants to impose sanctions on the Iranian people, targeting people for death. He just does it.
Yes.
He wants money for the wall. Okay, he went through the motions asking Congress for an appropriation. He doesn't get it. He's going to do it anyway. And a lot of this is rooted in what Roosevelt was doing. I mean, Roosevelt really was an economic dictator. I mean, the way he was behaving, I mean, he had Congress in his pocket, so they would do whatever he wanted anyway. But, you know, one interesting aspect of this is back in those days, there was still a Supreme Court that was willing to declare these kind of things unconstitutional, unlike today's court that defers to whatever the president says, especially if he mentions the two magic words, national security. But back then, there were justices. They were called. Four of them were together. They were called the Four Horsemen: Sutherland, Butler, Van Devanner, and McReynolds. And they were voting to declare this socialist, fascist stuff, much of it unconstitutional, which it was. There was another swing vote, Roberts, that was joining them. So, you know, like the NRA, people say today, Richard, to us, oh, well, if you eliminated Social Security and Medicare overnight, there'd be chaos. And well, they were saying the same thing about the National Industrial Recovery Act. That they were saying, it was creating a lot of chaos. And this is what a lot of people don't realize, that this New Deal program of socialism and fascism was really making things a lot worse. It wasn't saving anything. Things were going from bad to worse. They would have been better off doing nothing with respect to these interventions and let the economy get out of this bubble that had been burst that had been created and caused and then burst by the Federal Reserve. But they were saying, if you get rid of the National Recovery Administration and the Blue Eagle campaign overnight, there'll be chaos. Well, the Supreme Court one day declared it unconstitutional. And on that very day, it's over. It's gone. There was no chaos. All of a sudden, there was a huge surge in economic prosperity by getting rid of this really fascist program. In fact, there's a great book on this called Three New Deals that compare Roosevelt's program with that of Adolf Hitler and that of Benito Mussolini. And there were remarkable similarities: public works projects, government management of the economy, big military spending, very, very similar propaganda campaigns like the Blue Eagle campaign. And the Blue Eagle campaign was very nefarious. I mean, if somebody wouldn't post a Blue Eagle in their store window, a business owner, man, people would rally in the community, sort of like the Trumpsters of those days. These were the Roosevelt supporters. And there would be boycotts and threats against this person for not displaying the Blue Eagle. Well, this is just not what a free society is all about. A free society is not a government-managed economy. It's not a government-controlled economy. It's not a welfare state. And yet, this is what Roosevelt's real legacy is on a domestic basis. The idea that you can use emergencies to totally revolutionize America's system without even the semblance of a constitutional amendment.
Yes, I think that we have to realize that while there's often been hue and cry, depending upon, again, who's in office and who's in the opposition about unconstitutional discretionary government presidential power concerning foreign affairs, intervening, military activities, and so on. Let's not forget that this is what Roosevelt was doing himself in the initial 2 years of the Second World War before America's entry. The Congress in the 1930s had passed neutrality acts signed by the president, Franklin Roosevelt himself. But Roosevelt decided that in spite of this, the U.S. was going to put its support behind Britain against the Germans. And in spite, rather than going to Congress and having the legislation changed, and he knew that the likelihood of that was low because all the public opinion polls of that time showed that 80%, 90% of the American public wished the United States to stay out of foreign wars, including the recently begun war in Europe between first the British and the French and the Germans. But instead of that, he decided to send convoys escorting American supplies across the Atlantic to Great Britain. He basically attempted to instigate military episodes between American destroyers and German submarines to try to force, through these cat and mouse chases, to force a German submarine to torpedo and maybe sink an American destroyer, to say, you see, they started it, they started it. He had the American military high command be working out joint strategies, military strategies to fight with the British to oppose the Germans before America's entry into the war. And then in the Pacific, as one of his advisors said, as Roosevelt put the screws on the Japanese because of their war in China, as one of his advisors said as Pearl Harbor was approaching, what we have to try to do is to maneuver the Japanese into firing the first shot. In other words, we have to seem like the innocent victim, even though we're the one with the stick pushing it through the cage and prodding the bear or the elephant or whatever, the lion. So all of these extra constitutional, in fact, anti-legal activities under his notions of what's right for America, what's going to be an emergency, a war that we can't avoid being in, were all begun under Roosevelt. And other presidents have just followed that path. So many of today's governmental sins can be placed at the foot of Franklin Roosevelt during his entire time in the White House, from 1933 to his death in 1945. And let me make one other thing. Oh, Trump, he goes into these meetings with Vladimir Putin, and there's not even a translator to take notes, and the notes are not available. Well, what is Trump saying to Putin, and what orders are Putin giving to Trump to follow? Hello? Roosevelt met with Stalin and had private conversations with Stalin, which we do know about because the president's translator did keep transcripts of these, and these were released by the U.S. government years after the Second World War. And what was Roosevelt basically saying? Here, take the Baltic republics. I know you want a friendly government in Poland, but please, 1944 is here. I need an election. Just don't say anything publicly. I mean, he was just trading away countries to Uncle Joe Stalin behind the backs and without congressional authority or approval or the knowledge of the American people. But I'm shocked. I'm shocked. Trump has an unreported conversation with Putin. Give me a break. Roosevelt was determining the fate of the world, peoples and countries, in dealings with Joseph Stalin, a mass murderer worse than Stalin, a Hitler, and without congressional approval or the knowledge of the citizens of the country. But again, where did this begin? Thank you, FDR.
Yeah, I mean, here you have a constitution, which is the charter that brings the federal government into existence, and it sets forth the powers of the respective branches of the government. And one of those powers is the power to declare war. And the framers made it very clear, because Americans would never have supported calling the federal government into existence if the president could declare the war. And they wanted the power to declare war, to decide whether America goes to war or not, in the hands of Congress, not the president. The president would have the responsibility of waging the war, but Congress decides should we go to war or not. And Roosevelt was a clear example of circumventing that, as you point out, that he knew he couldn't get a declaration of war. People were so disgusted after what had happened with World War I, which was going to be the final war of all of them, and the war to bring the democracy to the world and make the world safe for democracy, and the war to end all wars. And instead, it had just paved the ground for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. So the last thing people wanted was another war. And the numbers were extraordinarily high. I don't remember what the statistic is. Maybe 70-80% of Americans
80%.
80% said no. So Roosevelt figures out a way to circumvent Congress again. And as you point out, he provokes the Germans, who refused to take the bait. They knew what he was doing. And he goes into the Pacific as a back door. And he starts provoking the Japanese with the hope and intent that they will attack, so he can say, oh, we've been attacked, we're innocent. And that's what the oil embargo was all about. That was what the humiliating demands in the settlement negotiations that were taking place. It's what leaving the bait at Pearl Harbor was all about. Roosevelt wanted entry into the war, but he knew he had to get the Japanese to attack first. And just totally morally repugnant conduct. And of course, we see this being repeated in Venezuela, where Trump is over there provoking the Venezuelans with this so-called humanitarian aid, which is nothing more than U.S. taxpayer-funded largesse provided thanks to the military. And he's down there insulting and provoking and doing whatever he can to provoke an incident, so that then he can say, as Roosevelt did, my fellow Americans, we've been attacked in Venezuela. We were just trying to do the right thing, helping people that we don't want to come into our country because we're building a Berlin Wall over here to keep them out. And that also raises Roosevelt's policy on immigration, whose mindset was pretty much the same as Trump's. That when Hitler, a lot of people don't realize this, a lot of Americans, this is not the type of thing you're going to learn in America's government public schools. But in the 1930s, Hitler was willing to let German Jews out of the country. He just wanted to get rid of them. And his preferred method was, hey, just leave. There were no concentration camps that were killing people. The Holocaust did not get going till the war started. So in the 1930s, it was, hey, go. And no countries wanted to take them. Now, under America's prior system of open immigration, they could have just come to the United States, no questions asked. But by this time, the statists had adopted their system of immigration controls. So what was Roosevelt's response to Hitler? Oh, no, we have the quota system. And that means that once the quota is filled of German immigrants, we don't have room for anybody else. Oh, and we have a Great Depression. They will steal jobs away from Americans. And so you've got this system that is being used to prevent German Jews from coming into the United States. And there's that famous story of the Voyage of the Damned, where a German ship is coming up first in Cuba, where they turn them away, but it's filled with Jewish refugees. They come to Miami Harbor, and under Roosevelt's immigration system, they have the Coast Guard surrounding the ship and refusing to let even one Jew disembark and save his life by coming into Germany. And they told him, you just have to go back to Germany. I mean, this is one of the most incredible stories of U.S. immigration controls. So the ship starts to return to Germany, and of course you can imagine what was going on in the minds of these refugees. And at the last minute, some European countries allowed them in, some in England. The ones that ended up in Europe, most of them got killed anyway because the Germans invaded soon thereafter. But this is the legacy of Roosevelt, what he did with respect to the American attitude toward German refugees who were Jewish, this monstrous system of welfare statism and warfare statism that would evolve into the national security state in the late 1940s or mid 1940s. It really is a horrible legacy. And then, of course, this concept of using emergencies for expansion of power, provoking people into starting wars as an excuse to effect regime change operations. It really is a horrific legacy for America, Richard.
Yes, Roosevelt was very much of a pragmatist. And the thing is that the worst thing is that it's not as if Franklin Roosevelt, secret communist agent. The fact is, he didn't even think in those terms. He was just president who felt he could do what he thought was right. At one of his Oval Office press conferences, a reporter asked him, "Well, Mr. President, some call you a communist, others call you a fascist. How do you view yourself?" And Roosevelt actually seemed startled by this, and he said, "Well, I'm just a Christian and a Democrat." And then during the war, he had another one of his Oval Office press conferences, and one of the reporters said, "Well, President Roosevelt, here we are fighting fascism in Europe, but we're supporting fascist dictators in the Caribbean, like Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. How can we justify this?" And Roosevelt, with his cigarette holder, yes, Trujillo is a fascist, but he's our fascist. See, you can't tell who's the good guy or the bad guy without the president's scorecard.
All right, well, I know.
It's probably the most dangerous part of this. Just this idea that I'm not even thinking in terms of principles or concepts.
Well, and you see it across the political spectrum where Republicans call themselves free enterprise and supporting every socialist program that comes down the pike, or limited government, while supporting the huge national security state and its policy of foreign interventionism and empire. And of course, the Democrats are on the exact same page. Their fight is over just variations and reforms, but in principle, they've all come down on the same policy, the same mindset, the same philosophy that Roosevelt did. No real deep philosophical framework, but overall within a framework of statism. All right, I know we're out of time, but I want you to tell our viewers a little story that many years ago, when we were discussing the New Deal, I was working at the Foundation for Economic Education, and you came up to visit, and we started going to used bookstores, and you exposed me to the anti-Roosevelt, anti-FDR books that were being published in the 1930s, which were absolutely fascinating. So tell us a little bit about your collection, how you discovered this, and a little bit about those books.
Well, I just mentioned is that they're long out of print. A few are available online in free PDFs, but it is forgotten today. And I came across them when I was in graduate school. I was in New York, and there were great used bookstores there that I would sort of haunt frequently. And I discovered this well of anti-Roosevelt literature. Now, some of them were just cranky things, but most of them were written by correspondents, reporters, serious policy analysts, fundamentally critical of him, that he was following a path of fascism, a form of socialism, that government interventionism represented an overthrow of traditional American constitutional government. Let me just give one example. You had mentioned the Supreme Court overthrowing the core New Deal legislation, NRA and AAA. The founder publisher of U.S. News World Report was a man named David Lawrence. And shortly after these Supreme Court decisions against these core New Deal programs, Roosevelt became very upset. These are these 9 old men who want to keep America in the horse and buggy era. Well, David Lawrence wrote a very good little book called 9 Wise Men, in which he talked about the Supreme Court justices who believed that the principles of freedom captured in the Constitution was more important than the apparent political expediencies of the day. And these men had much greater wisdom than a president who just wanted to arbitrarily do what he wants. That's just one indication of this literature. It's dozens upon dozens of books that basically have been forgotten. But there's a well of fascinating literature written of the time. One other example, if I can just take a moment, you can go online and you can find old issues, all of them, in fact, of American Mercury magazine, which in the 20s and early 30s was edited by H.L. Mencken, the famous satirist and humorist. And in 1933-34, he has a series of excellent articles talking about the New Deal mentality, Dr. Roosevelt as a policy quack, and then between 1935 and 1939, in the pages of American Mercury, there was a monthly column by the great libertarian essayist Albert J. Nock. And again, they're all available free online. You can find them all. And his monthly column was called The State of the Union. And most of them are running commentaries on the absurdity and the dangers of Roosevelt's policies in the second half of the 1930s. And they're insightful, they're reasonable, they're grounded in right-thinking principles of personal and economic liberty. And unfortunately, much of this has just gone down a memory hole. But it is there for those who want to take the time to rediscover it.
Yeah, John T. Flynn was another one.
Yes.
And then there's the material about World War II and what Roosevelt did to provoke the Japanese. Morgenthau.
Yes, Harry Elmer Barnes, Backdoor to War.
Tansel.
By Tansel. There's a whole array of this literature written either during or immediately after the Second World War. Some of it after, some of it before all of the government, State Department, and related documents were released. But whether written before all the documents were available or after when they were, it is clear that the president had chosen a course that because he believed that he knew what was right, America had to fight in this war. America had to take sides. The American people had to be aroused for a global crusade to bring a new deal to the world, that he would do all of these extra constitutional things and to set path of America on a path of, as a collection of essays is called, Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace.
Yeah, and you reminded me of William Henry Chamberlain's book, America's Second Crusade.
Second Crusade, yes.
Yeah. So, all right, Richard, greatly enjoyed the conversation as always, and look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, and thank you, viewers and listeners, for giving a little bit of your time to join us once again.
Yeah, let me reinforce that. Thank you all for your great support and your interest in our work and your nice comments that we received from you. And we look forward to seeing you next week. If you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org. Richard, until next week.
Bye-bye.